My name is Emma Walsh, and I am 31 years old. 11 months ago, I was rushed to the emergency room at 2 in the morning with abdominal pain so severe I could not stand upright. By 4 in the morning, I was in surgery for an emergency appendectomy, the kind that does not give you time to prepare or plan or arrange for anyone to be with you, the kind that happens to you while you are alone and frightened and not at all ready for it. When I came out of surgery, groggy and disoriented and still trying to understand where I was and what had happened to my body, the first thing I did was reach for my phone. The first call I made was to my parents. They were my parents. They were the people I had been calling my entire life when something was wrong and I needed to hear a voice that loved me and did not require me to explain why I needed to hear it. My mother answered on the third ring. I told her what had happened, my voice still rough from the anesthesia tube, my hands shaking against the phone case, my eyes not entirely able to focus on the ceiling above my hospital bed. I told her I had just come out of emergency surgery. I told her I was alone. I told her I needed her. And my mother said,
Oh, Emma, sweetheart, we can't come right now. Your sister's moving this weekend. We've had this planned for months. Everything is already arranged. But we will come as soon as Lauren is settled. I promise you, it won't be long.
The hospital room was very quiet when she said that, not in a peaceful way, in the way of a room where something important has just been absorbed into the walls. I held the phone and looked at the IV line running into my arm and the monitors beside my bed and the empty chair in the corner of the room where a person could have been sitting if a person had come, and I said,
Okay, Mom. I understand.
I did not understand, but I said I did because I had been trained by a lifetime of family dynamics to make the people I loved comfortable with the choices they had already made. They did not come for 4 days. When they finally walked through the door of my hospital room 4 days after the surgery, 3 days after I had been told I was well enough for discharge, but had nowhere safe to go alone to recover my mother, took one look at me and her face did something I had never seen my mother's face do before. She looked at the IV, at the monitoring equipment, at the pale and diminished version of her daughter lying in a hospital bed, and she understood, all at once, what she had chosen over this. She said 3 words, and those 3 words cost her more than anything she had said to me in my entire life. She said,
What have we done?
Before I tell you what happened in that room, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely means something to you. Drop your city and local time in the comments below. I love knowing where you are watching from, and I read every single comment. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the family that built the shape of what happened that night, to the sister whose house move was more important, and to the parents who would spend the rest of their lives understanding what they chose. The Walsh family had a grammar that I had learned before I was old enough to have a word for grammar. It was the grammar of a family that had 2 daughters and loved them both genuinely and could not quite manage to love them equally, not because they were unkind people, but because families are systems, and systems develop preferences the way rivers develop courses gradually, through the path of least resistance, until the channel is deep enough that changing direction requires more effort than anyone has thought to apply. My sister Lauren was 3 years older than me, the firstborn, the daughter my parents had been ready for when she arrived and had organized their expectations around before I came along and complicated them slightly. She was warm and loud and needed things in the visible, immediate way of people who have always known that needing things produces results. She called my parents frequently, with the frequency of someone who had never had to worry about being too much. And my parents answered those calls with the particular attentiveness of people who had been trained by years of practice to orient toward a specific voice. I was the quieter daughter, not cold, not withdrawn. I was a person who laughed easily and had good friendships and expressed genuine warmth to the people I loved. But I had learned, somewhere in the formative years when children absorb the logic of their families, that my needs were best managed with economy, that asking once was more effective than asking twice, that taking up less space was easier than taking up the space I actually required and watching people struggle to accommodate it. By adulthood, I had built a life I was genuinely proud of. I worked as a physical therapist, work I found meaningful and challenging in equal measure, helping people rebuild their bodies after they had been damaged in ways they had not chosen. I lived alone in a city 2 hours from my parents, in an apartment I had made into a real home through careful attention to the details that make a space feel like a life rather than a storage unit. I had good friends, a solid routine, the ordinary happiness of a person who has figured out how to be mostly all right on her own. The mostly was where the family story lived. My parents were good to me in the ways they knew how to be. They called. They visited when they visited. My father remembered my birthday with a card that always arrived exactly on time, which I knew was actually my mother's doing, but which I appreciated regardless. My mother asked about my work and my friends and my life with genuine interest that sometimes translated into real engagement and sometimes translated into a set of questions she asked because she was a good mother and good mothers ask questions. But when Lauren needed something, the response was different. Not dramatically, not cruelly. Just different in the specific way of a family that has one child who asks loudly and one who asks quietly and has learned, over decades, to calibrate its attention to the louder signal. When Lauren had her wisdom teeth removed, both parents drove 2 hours to stay with her for 3 days. When I had my tonsils out at 24, my mother sent soup via a meal delivery service and called every evening for a week. Both versions of care were real. They were not the same version. I had made peace with most of this the way I made peace with most things, by filing it in the category of the way things are, deciding I would rather invest my energy in building my life than in resenting the architecture of my original one and getting on with it. The appendix rupture made peace with none of it. The night it happened was an ordinary Tuesday that became an extraordinary Tuesday without announcing its intentions. I had come home from work, eaten dinner, started watching something on television, and felt a twinge of discomfort in my right side that I noted and dismissed as the kind of minor physical complaint that a day of work produces and that disappears with rest. An hour later, the twinge was a pain. An hour after that, the pain was a thing that demanded to be taken seriously. By midnight, I was on my bathroom floor, unable to stand upright, and the part of me that worked in healthcare was cutting through the fear and naming what was happening with clinical clarity. I called an ambulance because I was alone and driving myself was not going to be possible, and I sat on the bathroom floor and waited for the sound of sirens and tried to breathe through pain that was becoming something that did not have casual language for it. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I remember the particular relief of other people entering a space where I had been managing something alone. The relief that is not quite peace, but is the closest thing to it that emergency situations produce. One of the paramedics, a woman named Clara with an efficient calmness about her, took my hand while her partner prepared the stretcher, and she said,
You did the right thing calling us. You're going to be okay. Is there anyone you'd like us to contact while we get you ready?
I said my parents' names and their phone number, and she wrote it down, and the ambulance moved through the city at a speed that made the street lights smear, and I held the side rail and focused on breathing and on the fact that I had gotten to the right people, and the right people were doing the right things. I was in surgery by 4 in the morning. The surgeon, a compact and direct man named Dr. Reyes, who spoke to me for approximately 3 minutes before they put me under, told me what was happening with the matter-of-fact precision of someone for whom emergency appendectomies at 4 in the morning were part of a known category of events, and he said,
Your appendix has already perforated, which means we need to move quickly. The surgery itself is about an hour. When you wake up, you'll be sore and you'll have drainage tubes in, but you're going to be fine. Do you have any questions?
I could not organize them into words. I said no, and the anesthesia came, and then I was somewhere else entirely for an hour. When I came back into my body, it was in pieces. The awareness of the room before the awareness of what had happened in it. The ceiling before the IV. The IV before the pain, which arrived last and arrived fully. I reached for the phone on the bedside table with the instinct of someone who has just been through something frightening alone and needs to end the alone part of it. My mother answered. I told her, and she told me about Lauren's house move, and I said I understood, and I put the phone face down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling for a very long time before I let myself feel what I was feeling. What my parents did not understand about Lauren's house move, and what I had only understood gradually over the previous months, was that the move had been complicated from the beginning in ways that were largely of Lauren's making. Lauren was 34, recently separated from her husband of 6 years, and had decided to relocate from the house she had shared with him into a new apartment across the city. This was, objectively, a significant life transition that deserved the support of her family. I had never disagreed with that. I had, in fact, been one of the first people she called when she told us the marriage was ending, and I had driven 2 hours on a Friday night to sit with her for the weekend because she had needed someone there, and I had been available and willing to be that person. What had developed in the months since was a pattern that I had watched with the slightly helpless feeling of someone who sees a pattern forming and cannot find the intervention point. The move had been scheduled and rescheduled 3 times. Each rescheduling had been due to circumstances within Lauren's control, a lease timeline she had not managed, logistics she had not organized until the last possible moment, decisions that needed to be made and had been deferred until deferral was no longer an option. Each rescheduling had reorganized my parents' lives accordingly. They had taken time off work twice to help with the move that had not happened on the dates they had taken the time off for. They had driven to Lawrence City and back on a Saturday that turned into a Sunday because the packing was not done. They had absorbed all of this with the patient, slightly exhausted love of parents who are in the middle of a long, difficult situation with one child and are doing their best. None of this was Lauren's fault in a simple or clean way. She was going through a divorce. Difficulty was appropriate, but I had watched it reshape the family's attentional landscape in a way that left very little room for anything else. And I had watched my parents become so organized around Lauren's needs that the organizing had begun to feel permanent rather than situational. When I called from the hospital, they were not choosing a house move over a daughter in surgery. They had convinced themselves they were choosing between 2 daughters who both needed them, and that one daughter's need was more planned for and more expected and therefore more manageable to address. That reasoning was wrong, but it was not heartless. It was the reasoning of people who had been inside a long and draining situation and had lost the capacity to step outside it far enough to see it clearly. This did not make the 4 days alone easier to live through, but it mattered to me later, when I was trying to understand rather than simply to feel. My father called me back 30 minutes after I had spoken to my mother. I could hear in his voice that the call was an attempt at repair, that he had heard something in what my mother had reported back to him that had made him pick up the phone. He said,
Emma, I want you to know we're going to come the moment we can. Lauren's move is this weekend, and then we're coming straight to you. I know this isn't what you need to hear right now. I'm sorry.
The apology was genuine. I could hear that it was genuine. I could also hear that it did not change anything about the chair in the corner of the room that was empty and the hours that were going to pass before it was filled, and the surgery I had just come out of that had happened to my body while I was alone. I said it was okay, he said.
I know, Dad.
I put the phone down and pressed the call button for the nurse and asked if someone could bring me more water, because the asking was a thing I could do, and doing a thing felt more useful than lying in the middle of what I was feeling, without moving. The first day after surgery was the hardest in this specific way that first days are hard, not because of the physical pain, which was managed adequately by the medications, but because of the length and emptiness of the hours. Hospital time is different from regular time. It moves slowly and without the markers that make regular time feel structured, the meetings, the commute, the small decisions of an ordinary day. In their place is a succession of clinical interventions, vital sign checks, medication schedules, and the long intervals in between. I had my phone. I had the television mounted to the wall at an angle designed for a resting patient who does not want to strain their neck. I had the view from the window, which was of an internal courtyard, with a concrete bench that nobody appeared to use. I had the low-grade background noise of a hospital floor, which is its own particular soundtrack, the distant alarm that always resolves, the quiet voices outside the door, the specific squeak of specific types of footwear on the linoleum corridor. My friend Jess came that afternoon. She was the one I had texted from the post-surgery haze, and she had arrived 3 hours later with flowers from the hospital gift shop and a bag of snacks that the nurses told her were not appropriate given my dietary restrictions, but that she left anyway, in case the restrictions were eventually lifted. She sat in the corner chair, the empty chair, for 2 hours and talked to me about ordinary things, and I was more grateful for her presence than I knew how to say without making it seem larger than a friendship visit should need to be. She said, at some point near the end of the visit, looking at me with the careful expression of someone who was choosing their words.
Your parents are really not coming until after the weekend?
I said no. I said Lauren was moving. I said it was already planned. She was quiet for a moment in a way that communicated several things without saying any of them, and then she said,
Okay, I'm gonna come back tomorrow and the day after. You are not gonna sit in this room alone, Emma. That's just not happening.
she meant it. She came both days. She brought my neighbor Priya with her on the second day, and Priya brought actual food from the restaurant near our building that she had carried in a tote bag under her jacket past the reception desk with the casual confidence of someone who had decided the rules were negotiable in this specific situation. I was grateful for Jess and Priya in the deep, specific way that genuine acts of showing up produce. But I also want to be honest about what they were not able to be, which is my parents. There is a specific quality to parental presence during illness. Something about being known completely, about the particular comfort of a person who has been aware of your body since it was very small and who carries that awareness as something more than information. Jess and Priya were wonderful. They were not that. My mother texted twice the first day. Once in the morning, "Thinking of you, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Once in the afternoon, "Lauren's movers confirmed for Saturday." Shouldn't be more than a day or two after that. I read both messages and replied to the first one and did not reply to the second because I could not find any words for it that were both honest and kind, and in the absence of both, I chose silence. 6th and 3rd days in the hospital were a different kind of difficulty than the first. The physical pain was diminishing, which meant the other things had more room. The loneliness took up more of the space the pain had previously occupied. The specific loneliness of a person who is in a situation that requires being cared for and is being cared for by people who are not the people who should be there. Dr. Reyes came on his morning rounds and told me the recovery was progressing well. He had the efficient warmth of a doctor who genuinely liked his patients, but had a large number of them, and he asked me each morning whether I had family or support at home for when I was discharged, and each morning I told him I was working on it, which was a version of the truth that required no further questions. What I was actually working on was figuring out how to manage a recovery from abdominal surgery in my apartment without anyone to help me. The discharge instructions were straightforward in theory: rest, limited movement, wound care, no lifting, no driving for 2 weeks. In practice, they assumed the existence of a person who could help with grocery runs, who could be present during the nights when post-surgical pain spikes without warning, who could drive me to the follow-up appointment. I called my friend Marcus, not my brother, my friend, the one who had a car and lived nearby, and asked if he could help with the logistics. He said yes immediately and without making me explain why I was asking him rather than family, which told me that Jess had probably told him something. I was grateful for the not explaining. On the second night, around 11, I sent my parents a longer message than usual. I had been writing it and deleting it for most of the day, trying to find the version that was honest without being an accusation, that communicated what was true without requiring them to defend themselves before they had heard me fully. What I finally sent said that I was doing okay physically, that I was being looked after by friends, and that I wanted them to know that being here alone had been harder than I had expected, and that I hoped we could talk about it when they came. I sent it and put my phone face down and closed my eyes. My mother replied 40 minutes later. She said,
I know, Emma. I know it hasn't been right, and I am going to make it right when we get there. Lauren's movers are coming Saturday morning. We'll leave right after.
I read it and turned the bedside light off and lay in the hospital room in the dark for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the floor, feeling the ache in my abdomen that the medication managed but did not eliminate, and thinking about what it meant to be 31 years old and lying alone in a hospital bed waiting for your parents to come. My father texted at midnight separately, which was unusual for him. He was not a late-night person. What he sent was very short, he said.
I love you, Emma. I should have been there. I'm sorry.
Those 12 words from my father in the middle of the night, while I was alone in a hospital room, were in some ways the most honest thing he had said to me in years. I held the phone in the dark and read them several times. Then I turned the screen off and eventually slept. Let me pause here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever needed your parents and had them choose something else? Have you ever lain somewhere difficult and felt the specific weight of a phone that could call them but knew the call would not produce what you needed? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one, and I think this particular kind of hurt is more common than any of us talk about. If this story is reaching somewhere real in you, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because what happened when my parents finally walked through that door is something I am still processing, 11 months later. The third day in the hospital was a Saturday. Lauren's moving day. I knew this not because anyone told me directly, but because I did the math. My mother had said the movers were coming Saturday morning, which meant Saturday was happening right now in the world outside my hospital window, with my parents driving to Lauren's old apartment and assembling their energy and attention around a move that had already been rescheduled twice and had been reorganized around a surgery they had chosen not to interrupt it for. I had decided to stop monitoring what was happening with Lauren's move. The decision was not resentment, exactly more like a form of self-preservation. The choice to stop looking in the direction of the thing that was hurting and to focus instead on the things that were manageable. Jess came again in the morning. My friend Marcus texted to confirm he could pick me up when the discharge was arranged. Dr. Reyes came on his rounds and said if the next blood work came back clean, I could likely go home Sunday. I told Jess about the possibility of discharge on Sunday, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked if I had anyone to stay with me the first few nights, and I said I thought I could manage, and she gave me the look she gave when she had decided something and was deciding how to say it, and she said,
"You're not managing alone. I'm going to stay with you the first 2 nights, and I need you to let me do that without telling me it's too much."
She said it with the firmness of someone who had been watching the situation for 3 days and had made up her mind. I looked at her sitting in the corner chair, this person who had appeared in my hospital room without being asked and had organized her own life around my situation for 4 days, and I felt the specific, almost unbearable gratitude that comes from being genuinely cared for by someone you did not expect it from in the same measure you received it. I said thank you, and she nodded as though it did not require thanks, and we watched something on the television mounted to the wall and did not talk about my parents or Lauren or the weekend or any of it for the rest of the afternoon. The blood work came back clean. Discharge is scheduled for Sunday morning. My parents called Saturday evening. They were still at Lauren's. The move had gone longer than expected, which seemed to surprise everyone except me, and my mother's voice had the texture of a person who had been doing physical work all day and was tired in the way that does not leave room for much else. She said Lauren's new apartment was coming together and they would leave in the morning, and they would be at the hospital by early afternoon. I told her I was being discharged Sunday morning, and there was a pause, and she said,
"Oh, we'll come to your apartment then. We'll be there by early afternoon. I promise."
I said okay. I said I would see them tomorrow. I ended the call and sat in the hospital bed on my last night in it and looked at the concrete courtyard below the window and thought about all the things that were true simultaneously: that my parents loved me, that they had made a choice that had hurt me, that they were coming tomorrow, that tomorrow was not now, and that the gap between those things was something I was going to have to figure out how to bridge or not bridge after I had gotten some sleep. Marcus picked me up Sunday morning at 10. He had brought a bag of groceries that he had compiled based on Jess's list. Soft foods, things that required minimal preparation, things that would not require me to stand at the stove. He carried them upstairs to my apartment without being asked to and set them on the counter and asked me if I needed anything else before he left for his own Sunday. I told him he had already done more than he needed to do, and he said it was not about what he needed to do, and then left before I could thank him properly, which was very much in keeping with the way Marcus operated. Jess arrived 20 minutes later with a bag of her own and began, with cheerful efficiency, to make my apartment into a better version of a recovery space, pillows arranged to support sitting up on the couch. The coffee table brought closer so things were within reach, a small stack of the books she knew I liked placed on the end table. She moved through the space with the focused purpose of someone who had a task they had thought through in advance. I sat on the couch and watched her and felt the full weight of the week that had just happened arrive all at once. The way things arrive when you have been managing them at a distance and have finally arrived in a space where you can stop managing. The surgery, the hospital room, the 4 nights alone, the concrete courtyard outside the window, the empty corner chair before Jess came the first afternoon. All of it sat down with me on the couch, and would not be moved. Jess came and sat beside me and did not say anything, which was the right thing to do, and I cried for about 10 minutes into the silence of my own apartment, which was also the right thing to do. And then I felt marginally better and asked her to put the kettle on. My parents arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon. I heard my mother's voice in the stairwell before I heard the knock. The particular cadence of her voice when she was talking quickly, which she did when she was nervous or when she was managing something, and she was talking to my father in the low, urgent tone they used when they were deciding something between them before they faced a situation. Then the knock. Jess got up and opened the door and stepped back, and my parents came in. My mother walked in first. She had been in this apartment before. She had visited twice since I moved in, knew the layout, knew where things were. But the apartment that greeted her was different from the apartment she remembered. The modifications, Jess had made the pillows, the coffee table moved closer, the water bottles and medications arranged on the end table within reach, the quiet presence of a friend who had clearly been here for several days managing what my parents had not, were visible to her immediately. And I watched her read them. She walked from the doorway to the middle of the room, taking in the details with the focused attention of a woman assembling a picture she had not been given the pieces of in advance. She saw the prescription bottles on the end table. She saw the discharge paperwork stacked on the kitchen counter. She saw the faint marks on my right side where the hospital bracelet had been. She saw me, on the couch, paler than she had last seen me, moving with the careful deliberateness of a person whose core had been cut through and was still healing. And then my mother, who was not an impulsive person, who was not someone who made scenes or spoke without having organized her words, who had spent 31 years being the composed and capable parent who handled things and did not fall apart in front of her children, looked at everything in that apartment that she was seeing for the first time, everything she had not been there for, and something in her face completely gave way. She crossed the room and 3 steps and sat on the couch beside me and put her arms around me, which she had not done in the careful way, the way that avoided my right side and did not put weight on the drainage site, the way of someone who suddenly understood exactly where the injuries were, because she was finally close enough to see them. And she said,
What have we done? Emma, what have we done?
She said it not as a question, exactly, more as a thing that was true, emerging from a place too deep for the usual careful organization of words. I felt her shaking slightly, not crying yet, just the physical expression of something that needed more containment than her body currently had available. I put my head against her shoulder and did not say anything at all for a moment. My father had come in behind her and was standing near the doorway with the expression of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of something he thought he understood. He was looking at the apartment, and my mother and me on the couch, at Jess, who had quietly moved to the kitchen to give us space, at the evidence of a week he had not been present for. He walked to the couch and sat on the other side of me, and he put his hand over mine, and he said,
I'm so sorry, Emma. I am so deeply, deeply sorry.
The 3 of us sat on my couch in the afternoon light of a Sunday, and I let myself be held by both of my parents at the same time, which had not happened in a very long time, and I cried the kind of cry that is also a release, that carries with it the accumulated weight of the previous week, and sets some portion of it down. Jess stayed in the kitchen for a polite amount of time, and then quietly said she was going to get some groceries and left. She was gone for an hour and a half, which was considerably longer than groceries required. After the initial tearful reunion settled into something quieter, my father got up and made tea, which was the thing he did when he needed something to do with his hands and his energy during a difficult conversation. He moved through my kitchen with the particular care of a man who did not know the layout well enough to be efficient, but who was determined to be useful. My mother and I sat on the couch, and I looked at her face, the tiredness in it from a week of Lauren's move, the specific guilt that had settled over the tired, and I tried to decide what kind of conversation this was going to be. I had been thinking about this conversation for 4 days. I had imagined versions of it that were primarily angry, versions that were primarily sad, versions where I said very little and let the silence communicate what I felt, versions where I said too much and could not find a way back from the saying. I had settled. somewhere in the second hospital night on the version that was simply honest, that did not require a performance of either my pain or my forgiveness, that said the true things and made room for the true things they needed to say in return. I started at the beginning, because the beginning was the right place to start. I told my mother what the first night had been like, the waking up from surgery alone, the call to her, the phone put face down on the mattress. I told her what the second day had been like, with Jess in the corner chair and the gratitude I felt for Jess and the specific thing that Jess was not able to be. I told her about Dr. Reyes asking each morning if I had family support at home for the discharge and my telling him I was working on it. My mother listened to all of it without interrupting, which was not easy for her. She was, by temperament, someone who wanted to intervene in a difficult story before it finished, wanted to offer the reassurance or the explanation before the telling was complete. That she did not interrupt was itself a form of the effort she was making, and I registered it. When I had said what I needed to say, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said,
I told myself that you would be okay, because you are always okay. And I know what I'm saying, Emma. I know how that sounds. I know it means I use the fact that you handle things well as a reason to not be there. And I am not okay with having done that.
she said it, with a kind of bare honesty that was uncomfortable to hear because it was precise. She had named the exact mechanism that my competence, my reliable okayness, had been used as a justification for the choice. And she was not looking for my absolution. She was looking at the choice clearly and saying what she saw. My father came back with the tea and set mugs on the coffee table and sat in the armchair across from us. And for a while the three of us were quiet. And the quiet held everything that had been said and everything that had not yet been said, and the particular weight of a family moment that has arrived at a truth everyone needed and nobody wanted. Then my father said,
I need to tell you something, Emma, that I should have said on the phone from the hospital 4 days ago. I knew when your mother and I made that decision that it wasn't right. I knew it before we finished making it. And I went along with it anyway because changing it would have meant disrupting everything with Lauren. And I chose the easier thing. I need you to know that I know that.
The honesty of it landed hard in the quiet room, not because it made anything better in the immediate sense, but because it was real, and real things have a weight that comfortable things do not, and sometimes the real thing is more valuable than the comfortable thing even when it costs both of you more. I sat between my parents on my own couch in my own apartment, with the tea my father had made on the coffee table, and I said what was true. I said,
I know neither of you meant to hurt me, but you did hurt me. And I need us to be able to say that clearly before we move past it. Not because I want anyone to feel worse, but because I think we have been moving past things without saying them clearly for a very long time, and it doesn't seem to be working.
My mother put her hand over mine. My father nodded. The three of us sat with the truth of what I'd just said for a long moment, and in that moment something shifted in our family that I believe would not have shifted without the 4 days alone in the hospital room and everything that led to them. Some things, it turns out, require the exact condition they come with. You cannot get to them any other way. The conversation about Lauren happened the following afternoon. My parents had stayed the night, my mother on the pull-out couch, my father in the armchair with a blanket, which was itself an acknowledgement, the kind that does not require words, of the thing they had not done before. Lauren had called my mother that morning, checking in on the move's aftermath, and my mother had told her she was at my apartment, and there had been a pause on Lauren's end of the call that my mother described to me later as the pause of someone who is absorbing information and simultaneously trying to figure out how much they are implicated in it. Lauren came that afternoon. She arrived looking the way she always looked, after a difficult few days put together on the surface, running on something that was not quite the same as ease. She hugged me at the door carefully, having been warned by my mother about the incision site, and the hug was genuine. Lauren and I loved each other genuinely, and this situation was not the end of that. But the complications of what had happened lived inside the hug alongside the love. She sat across from me in my living room, and the four of us, my parents, Lauren, me, had the kind of conversation that families have when something has been broken open and everyone is in the room with the open thing, and the only path forward is through it. Lauren said what I had not expected her to say, which was that she had known on moving day that my parents coming to help her rather than coming to me was wrong. She had known when she heard about the surgery, and she had not said anything to my parents about it, had not suggested they go to me instead of staying with her, because needing them had felt more urgent to her than considering what I needed. She said,
I kept telling myself you'd be fine, that you were always fine. And I think I believed it because I needed to believe it. Because if you needed them as much as I did, then there was a real problem that I was part of. And I didn't want to be part of a problem.
She said it with the difficulty of someone who has had several hours to understand a thing about themselves that is not comfortable to understand and has decided to say it anyway. I appreciated the saying. I also felt the specific weight of the phrase, "you were always fine," because it was the same phrase my mother had used, and the repetition of it told me something about the story the family had been telling about me for a very long time. I said,
I want you to know that I don't blame you for needing Mom and Dad, Lauren. But I need both of you to understand that me being fine most of the time does not mean I will be fine in a hospital after emergency surgery. It means I am good at managing. Those are different things.
Lauren nodded. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. My father was looking at the coffee table with the expression of a man who is receiving accurate information about himself and is not trying to avoid it. The conversation lasted another 2 hours. Not all of it was difficult. Some of it was the kind of talking that families do when they have gotten to the real thing and found that the real thing is survivable, the particular relief of honesty that has been delivered and received without anyone leaving the room. My parents stayed for 3 days. 3 days of my mother doing my laundry and my father fixing the cabinet door that had been sticking since I moved in, and both of them simply being present in the particular way that presence is a form of repair, not of the thing that happened, which cannot be repaired in the sense of made happened, but of the relationship, the trust, the understanding of what each of us was to the others. My mother cooked on the second night. She made the soup she had made for me every time I was sick as a child, a specific recipe that I had not tasted in years, and that arrived in my kitchen smelling like the exact combination of home and comfort and the particular safety as being taken care of by a person who has been doing it since you were small. I sat at my kitchen table and ate it and said nothing for a moment. Then I said,
This is exactly what I needed 4 days ago.
My mother sat across from me and looked at me, and she said,
I know. I should have been here to make it 4 days ago. I am here to make it now.
It was not the same as 4 days ago. Nothing that comes after a difficulty is the same as the difficulty not having happened. But being here now, making the soup now, saying it out loud now, that was something. That was the beginning of what repair actually looks like, which is not the erasure of the wound, but the gradual demonstration that the person who caused it understands what they caused and has changed something about how they operate as a result. My father came and sat down and ate the soup too, and the three of us were at my kitchen table in the ordinary way of a family eating a meal together, and for a while that ordinary thing was enough. It has been 11 months since the surgery, 11 months of things being different in the ways that things become different when a family has had its version of a truth-telling moment and has decided to actually receive what was told. My parents call me more than they used to, not in the checking the box way that obligation calls sound, but in the way that calls sound when the person making them has reorganized something about how they understand who they are calling and why. My mother calls me Tuesday evenings now. She started it in the week after she left my apartment and has maintained it with a consistency that I think is deliberate. A correction kept up long enough to become a habit, which is what genuine change actually looks like. My father texts me. He is not, by nature, a phone person, but he sends short messages with a frequency that tells me he is thinking about me more consistently than he always showed before. Sometimes a link to an article he thought I would like, sometimes a question about my week, sometimes just a check-in that says nothing except that he was thinking of me and wanted me to know. Lauren and I had two more honest conversations after the one in my apartment, one by phone, one over dinner when she came to visit a month later. Both were uncomfortable in the necessary way of conversations that require people to look at things they have been avoiding. By the end of the second one, I understood her more fully than I had before, and I believe she understood me more fully than she had before, and we are navigating the relationship we have with more honesty than we had before the surgery. She called me on my birthday last month. Not to leave a voicemail she could mark done. She called and we talked for 40 minutes about real things. Her work, my work, how she was doing with the divorce, how I was doing with the recovery. It was the best birthday call she had ever given me, and I told her so, and she said it was overdue, and I agreed that it was. I went back to work 8 weeks after the surgery. I walked into the clinic on a Monday morning with the particular awareness of a body that has been through something significant and has come out on the other side of it, not unchanged but intact. I helped my first patient of the day, a man recovering from a knee replacement, with his mobility exercises, and I was aware while I was doing it of the particular quality of attention you bring to work that has a physical counterpart in your own experience. The work was the same. I brought something different to it. I had lunch alone that day and thought about everything that had happened since the Tuesday evening when the pain in my right side had been a twinge and not yet a thing. The surgery, the hospital room, the 4 nights alone, the empty chair before Jess came, my mother's voice on the phone saying we can't come yet, my father's midnight text, Jess making my apartment into a recovery space, my parents walking through the door, my mother saying, "What have we done?" I thought about what it had taken to get to the conversation the 4 days, the dishonesty of everyone saying you will be fine and using that saying as the reason not to come. The specific truth that my ability to be fine most of the time had been used against me in the one moment when it was not. True, I thought about what had changed as a result of the conversation and whether the change felt sustainable or fragile. It felt both, which I have come to understand is how real change feels. Always both more solid than you expected and more fragile than you hoped. A thing that requires maintenance and honesty and the willingness to keep looking at it rather than putting it on a shelf and trusting that it will hold. I want to tell you something before I finish this story, because I think it is the true thing, the one underneath all the narrative details and the family dynamics and the specific events of a specific week. Being the person who is always fine is a position you arrive at over years, gradually, through the accumulated experience of getting the message from your family, from your situations, from the way the world responds to you that your needs are most gracefully met when they are not too visible, not too demanding, not too inconvenient to the ongoing management of everything else. You are fine because you have learned to be fine. You are okay because you have practiced being okay. You handle things because handling things is what you do when the alternative is needing something from people who might not fully show up for the needing. That is not strength, entirely. Some of it is strength, but some of it is the particular kind of self-sufficiency that develops not from abundance, but from the quiet long-term experience of not wanting to confirm what you suspect, which is that your needs are optional in a way that certain other people's needs in your family are not. The appendix rupture was the moment when being fine was not available. When the pain was too immediate and the surgery too real and the hospital room too empty for the usual management to apply. And what happened when I could no longer be fine on command was that the people who had been relying on my fineness finally had to look at what it had been built on. I am grateful for what came out of it. Not for the 4 days alone, those were genuinely hard, and I would not romanticize them. But for the conversation, for the soup my mother made on the second night, for my father's midnight text and everything it contained, for Lauren saying I kept telling myself you'd be fine and knowing, when she said it, that she was saying something true and costly, for my parents walking into my apartment and seeing, all at once, what the week had looked like from where I was standing, for my mother saying, "What have we done?" for the fact that she did not stop at the saying of it but followed it with the staying. 3 days on a pull-out couch, the cabinet door fixed, the Tuesday phone calls that have not stopped in 11 months. That is what repair looks like, not the undoing of the thing, the ongoing evidence that the thing is understood and that the understanding has changed something. I still call my parents when something is wrong. I called my mother last month when I had a frightening medical result. A benign result, as it turned out, but frightening before it was, and she was at my apartment 12 hours later. She did not mention Lauren. She did not mention anything else. She simply came the way she should have come 11 months ago, and I let her, the way I am learning to let people show up when they show up. That is the best ending I have for this story. Not a perfect family. Not a healed wound that you cannot find anymore. A family that looked at something hard, said what needed to be said, and is building something more honest on the other side of it. One Tuesday phone call at a time. If you have stayed with me through this whole story, I want you to hear this. If you are the person in your family who is always fine, who handles things, who does not ask for too much because you have learned that asking for too much produces discomfort that you then have to manage, I want to tell you something important. You are allowed to need something. You are allowed to need your parents, your siblings, the people who are supposed to show up for you to actually show up. Being good at handling things does not obligate you to handle everything alone. Being capable is not the same thing as not needing. Being fine most of the time does not mean you will be fine during surgery alone in a hospital room at 2 in the morning. And if the people who love you have been using your fineness as a reason not to look too closely the way a family will sometimes use the reliable child's reliability as permission to focus elsewhere, that is something worth naming, not bitterly. Not as an accusation, but clearly, honestly, in a room where everyone can hear it and nothing can be unsaid. Because what my parents discovered when they walked into my apartment and saw the prescription bottles and the modifications Jess had made and the physical evidence of a week they had not been present for what they discovered was not that I had been deceiving them. They discovered that they had been making a choice, every time they had said she'll be fine, to not look at what fineness was built on. Let people see what it is built on. They may surprise you. My mother makes soup on Tuesday evenings and calls me when she does. My father fixed my cabinet door and texted me a photo of it when he was done. Lauren calls on my birthday and stays on the phone for 40 minutes and asks real questions. These are small things. They are the right things. Thank you for being here through this whole story. If it reached somewhere real in you, please like and subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me about the moment someone in your family finally showed up in the way you needed. I read every single one. Until next time, let yourself be seen and let yourself be needed and let the people who love you show up when they show up. That is enough. That has always been enough. There is something I have not yet told you about the 4 days alone that I want to tell you now, because I think it is the part that changed me the most. Not the hardest part, not the most dramatic part, but the part I return to most often when I think about what those 4 days actually did to me as a person. On the morning of the 3rd day, before Jess arrived, I woke up very early. The hospital floor was quiet in the particular way of very early morning, the night shift still on. The day shift not yet arrived, the patients who could sleep, still sleeping. The light through the window was the gray blue of early dawn, and the concrete courtyard below was empty and wet from rain that had fallen overnight. I lay in the hospital bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about my life in the specific, clear way that crisis produces. Not the panicked, frantic thinking of the night the pain started, but the quiet reckoning that sometimes comes after. I thought about what I had built. The apartment, the career, the friendships with Jess and Marcus and Priya that had revealed themselves in the past 3 days to be more substantial than most things I could have said with certainty I owned. I thought about my family. Not with anger. The anger had come and gone in waves and was resting between waves right now, but with something more like clear-eyed inventory. What did I actually have with my family underneath the comfortable narrative of love and connection that families maintain because the alternative is harder to hold? What was real there when you pressed on it? What I found, pressing on it in the gray-blue early morning of a hospital room, was this. The love was real. The interest was real. The phone calls and the birthday cards and the genuine happiness my parents expressed when my career went well, all real. And also, the pattern of allocation was real. The long-standing habit of orienting toward Lauren when Lauren needed something. The reliance on my fineness as a constant that did not need to be checked. The choice, when it came to an actual choice, that had been made without apparent awareness that it was a choice with costs. Both of those things were true simultaneously. I had known both of them for a long time, but I had only known them separately enough that I could hold on to the first one and manage the second one as an unfortunate feature of a generally good situation. The hospital room in the early morning made them sit side by side in a way they had not before, and sitting side by side they were harder to manage separately. I did not cry. I was slightly surprised to find I did not. I felt something more, like clarity, which is a colder thing than grief and in some ways more useful. The clarity said, "This is the situation. The situation is real, and it has a history, and you are not going to resolve the history by pretending the situation is something other than what it is. You are going to have to decide what you want to say and how you want to say it, and you are going to have to decide whether you want to say it at all or whether you are going to file it in the drawer with all the other things you have noticed and said nothing about." I decided in that gray-blue early morning that I was going to say it, not dramatically, not as an accusation, not with the hot edge of fresh anger, but clearly, because I was 31 years old and I had just had emergency surgery, and I was alone in a room that did not have to be this empty, and the situation had been made visible to me with a clarity that I understood was rare, and I was not going to waste it by going back to the way things had been before. That decision, made alone at 6 in the morning on the third day in a hospital room, was the real beginning of what changed between me and my family. The welcome dinner in Hawaii was its conclusion. The 3 days my parents spent in my apartment were its first evidence. But it started there, in the gray-blue light, in the room with the empty chair. There is something else I want to tell you about my mother, something that I understood only after she left my apartment following those 3 days, when I was sitting alone again, but alone in a different way. Not the alone of abandonment, but the alone of a person who has been with people and is now catching her breath in the space between. My mother was not a simple person. None of us are simple people, but mothers carry a particular complexity that I had not fully understood until I was old enough to see her as a person separate from the role. She had grown up in a family with her own dynamics, her own version of allocated attention, her own experience of being one daughter among others and learning what that meant about where she stood. She had brought those experiences into her parenting of Lauren and me, as all parents bring their histories into the rooms they create for their children, and some of what she had brought had served us and some of what she had brought had not. The particular thing she had brought that had shaped my experience of the 4 days alone was this. She had a deep and largely unexamined belief that love meant showing up for the person who was loudest in their need. Not consciously, not as a philosophy she had articulated more as a working assumption embedded in her reflexes. The person who needed the most visibly was the person who most needed to be responded to. The person who managed quietly could continue to manage quietly. She had said this in different words. During the 3 days she spent in my apartment, she had been trying to understand how the choice had been made, how the surgery and the 4 days had been possible. And she was tracing it back through the decisions to the assumptions underneath the decisions. And she had found this one, this belief that my being fine was information rather than an assessment she was making, that it reflected reality rather than what she had been oriented to see. She said it on the second evening while we were sitting on the couch after dinner. She said,
I think I have been reading you wrong for a long time. Not your love or your character, but your needs. I think I have been seeing what I expected to see rather than what was actually there. And I need to tell you that I am going to stop doing that.
She said it carefully and specifically, in the way of someone who has identified the mechanism and wants to name it precisely so it cannot hide again in general language. I received it carefully too, because it was the kind of thing that could easily be agreed to in the warmth of a difficult moment and then forgotten when the warmth faded and the ordinary patterns reasserted themselves. I said what I needed to say. I said,
I believe you mean that, Mom. And I am going to need to see it in the ordinary moments, not just in the hard ones. That's where it actually has to live.
She nodded. She did not defend herself or qualify what I had said. She simply received it as what it was, a specific, practical requirement being named by a daughter who had learned to be precise about what she needed, because precision was the only way she had ever managed to make anything stick. My father, across the room, said nothing in that moment. But he was listening in the attentive way he listened when he was filing something in the place where he kept the things that mattered and did not want to interrupt the filing. That evening changed something in the texture of the 3 days. Not because it resolved anything. One honest conversation does not resolve decades of an operating assumption, but because it had been said, named, put into language that both of us would be able to point to later, if we needed to point to something. I have pointed to it twice in 11 months, both times quietly, both times when I felt the old pattern beginning to reassert itself and needed to name what I was seeing. Both times my mother received it, adjusted, continued. That is what change looks like when it is real, imperfect and correctable and built from the same material as the thing it is trying to replace: human effort and human attention and the genuine desire to do better than you have done. I want to tell you about one more conversation that happened during those 3 days, a short one, between my father and me, on the morning before they left. My mother was in the shower. My father and I were in the kitchen. Him making eggs that I was going to be able to eat for the first time since the surgery without them being a challenge. He was standing at the stove and I was sitting at the kitchen table, and the morning light was coming through the window at the angle it comes at that time of year, and it was a quiet, ordinary domestic scene that I was aware of being inside in a particular way, aware that it was the kind of scene I had not had with my parents in my own apartment, because the visits had been brief and scheduled and had not included the mornings, had not included the ordinary, unremarkable time that is actually where families live when they are really present with each other. He cracked an egg into the pan and didn't look at me when he said it, because that was how he said things that were difficult, directed at the task in front of him rather than at the person behind him. He said,
I have been thinking for 3 days about what kind of father I have been. Not in the big moments, but in the ordinary ones. And I think the honest answer is that I've been the kind who assumed the quiet child was taken care of because she was quiet.
He said it to the pan. I looked at the back of his head, the gray that had come in since I last spent real time with him. The set of his shoulders that carried his characteristic, contained quality, and I felt something large and careful moving in my chest. I said,
I know, Dad. And I think the quiet child partly made herself quiet because it seemed like the thing that was needed. I don't think either of us chose this.
He nodded without turning around. He plated the eggs and put them in front of me and sat down across from me with his coffee, and we ate in the particular silence of two people who have just said something true and are sitting with the saying of it, which is sometimes the most important part. I do not know if my father will be different in all the ways that matter, or in some of them, or in ways I have not yet found to measure. He is 63 years old, and he is a man shaped by the same decades of a particular life that my mother has been shaped by. And people at 63 do not rebuild entirely from the foundation. But he got in the car and drove 2 hours to an apartment where his daughter had spent 4 days recovering from surgery alone, and he stayed 3 days on an armchair with a blanket, and he made eggs on the last morning before they left, and he said the thing to the frying pan that needed to be said. That is something, and a family that is quite a lot. 6 months after the surgery, Lauren came to visit me for a full weekend. Not a brief drop-in, not a Saturday afternoon, a full Friday to Sunday stay, which was the longest we had spent alone together as adults, without parents or partners as the organizing context. It was in some ways the visit I had always hoped we would eventually have, and had stopped expecting because the structure of our family had made it easy to keep the relationship at a certain comfortable depth, rather than pushing into the more complicated territory below. We talked about the divorce. She talked about it in a way she had not talked about it to me before. Not the managed version she presented to the family at large, with its careful narrative of two people who had grown in different directions and were handling it maturely, but the real version, with the grief in it and the anger, and the specific loneliness of a person whose life has been reorganized around an absence. I listened in the way I had been practicing the way Jess had sat in the corner chair in my hospital room without filling the silence, which I had taken notes on without realizing I was taking notes. I let Lauren talk until she had said what she needed to say rather than intervening with the reassurance or the solution that was my reflex. When she was done, she looked at me with an expression that was more open than her usual register. She said,
I don't think I have ever talked to you like this before. I think I didn't know how to be the one who needed something with you. You were always so together. It felt strange to be the one falling apart.
I said what was true and important for her to hear. I said,
I have been falling apart in my own ways for a long time, Lauren. I was just doing it somewhere you couldn't see.
She sat with that. Then she said that she was sorry. Not a general apology, a specific one. About the surgery, about the house move, about not saying anything to our parents that weekend when she knew and did not say it. It was the most honest apology my sister had given me in our shared lifetime, and I received it as what it was: real, costly, and the beginning of a relationship between us that I had given up on having at the depth it actually wanted to go. We went to a farmer's market on Saturday morning and to a good restaurant on Saturday night and watched a movie on Sunday afternoon, and somewhere in the middle of the ordinary weekend I understood that I liked my sister. Not as a family obligation, not in the complicated way of people who share too much history to be simple with each other, but in the actual way. I liked who she was when she was not performing the managed version of herself. I liked her humor and her warmth and the specific way she looked at things. I liked spending time with her. That had not been available to me before, or perhaps had been available, and I had not let myself access it, because the complications of the family dynamic had layered between us in a way that made something simple feel expensive. It does not feel expensive now. It just feels like a sister, finally, in the full sense of the word. I want to leave you with this. The surgery and the 4 days alone gave me something I would not have chosen to receive in the way that it came, but that I would not give back, because of what it produced in its aftermath. It produced honesty. The specific, uncomfortable, necessary honesty of a family that had been managing its complications rather than looking at them, finally in a room together with the complications visible and nobody able to look away. It produced change imperfect and ongoing and built from genuine effort rather than from a single dramatic resolution. It produced my mother's Tuesday phone calls and my father's eggs on a Sunday morning and my sister's full weekend visit and a conversation between Lauren and me on a Saturday night over a good meal at a restaurant I had chosen because it was the kind of restaurant she would like, which I knew, because I had been paying attention to who she was all along. It produced a version of my family that is more honest with itself than the version that existed before. I would not say it was worth the 4 days alone. I do not think in those terms. But I would say that the 4 days alone were the conditions under which the honesty became possible, and the honesty was worth everything that came after it, and everything that came after it is still coming. One Tuesday phone call at a time, one Sunday morning conversation at a time, one weekend visit, one honest apology, one real question asked and actually waited for. That is how families change. Slowly, imperfectly, in the ordinary moments where most of life actually lives. Thank you for being here through this whole story. If it reached something real in you, please like and subscribe, and leave me a comment telling me about the moment someone in your family finally showed up the way you needed. I read every one of them, always. Until next time.